Good morning. Excuse me. My apologies for the delay. Thank you for turning into Facebook Live for the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center's Coffee with a Survivor. Full disclosure, I am not a survivor and I am not drinking coffee as I have my morning tea. But I hope you will stick around anyway to hear my family's story. Jot down any questions you may have in the comments section and I will try to answer them after my presentation. My name is Steve Koek. My father, Joe Koek, was a survivor of the Holocaust in World War II. He was a featured speaker for over 10 years, sharing his story hundreds of times at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center in Skokie and at remote locations all across the country. He died suddenly in December 2015 at the age of 85, exactly 1 month to the day before he was to share his story with the world at the United Nations General Assembly in New York on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It is my hope to carry on his legacy and continue to share his story so that you and the generations after you can continue to learn from his experiences and the lessons he taught us all. Fortunately for me and for you, my father left behind the transcript that he used to read from when he spoke to groups like you. I now use it as a guide through his story and quote his very words throughout my retelling of his incredible life's journey. My father had two sisters who also survived the Holocaust and are still alive today. My Aunt Henny has lived in Holland all her life, and Aunt Eva lives in Chicago, where she celebrated her 90th birthday last March. The three of them were among the hidden children of Holland. The Netherlands is a small country in Western Europe that before World War II had about 140,000 Jews among its population. By 1946, there were only 30,000 left in the country, about 20% of the pre-war Jewish population. My father was born on October 30th, 1930, in The Hague, where he lived with his family until World War II came to the Netherlands. His original name was Joseph Koek, which I will type in the comments section, Koek, Koek. Both he and Eva changed it to Koek when they moved to America after the war, but many people would simply call him Joop, from his family as a young boy to his adult kids in America so many years later. He lived a wonderful life with his father and mother, Philip and Katriane Koek, and his two sisters, the older Eva and the younger Henny. A proud member of the Dutch Boy Scouts, Joop described his family life before the war as a lovely early childhood, never thinking it could change. On May 14, 1940, the Germans went back on a promise not to bring the Netherlands into World War II, and the Nazis invaded. Soon the Jewish people in the Netherlands were forced to wear a yellow star with the word Jew on it. The situation for Jews in the Netherlands and all over Europe would only get worse from there. My father's words. On August 18, 1942, my family received a letter ordering us to report to a train station, to be transported to a work camp. The next day, I am leaving home with a resistance guide. She is a total stranger, but we talk as she takes me to the end of the street, about 3 homes from our home. We turn right and keep on walking until we get to the home where I will spend the next few months in hiding. Being only 12 years old, I have no idea what to expect or what is going on. I do not turn around to wave goodbye to my parents. I do not kiss them goodbye. Looking back, now that I'm in my 80s, I am wondering what must have been going on in my mind, and more than that, what my parents must have been thinking. For years after the war, I punished myself for not dealing with our parting better. My parents hand over the children they love to strangers who they must trust. None of us knows what the future holds for us. We never see our parents again. My grandparents went into hiding too, and when the family did not show up at the train station as ordered, the Nazis went looking for them. They broke in and ransacked their home, destroyed all of their furniture, and threw the rest of their belongings into the trash by the street. After they left, a neighbor picked up the photos and other items that had been discarded and saved them for the family until after the war was over. The children wound up hiding in the top level of a three-story home with several other children in hiding. The middle level of the building was the living area for the family who was hiding them, and the lower level was a classroom. My dad's words. We were strongly discouraged from even looking out the window. The roof had eaves, so it was unlikely that anyone looking up would have been able to see us, even if we stood at the windows. But it was too great a chance to take, so we mostly kept away from the windows, keeping ourselves further isolated from the outside world. Just like his father before him, my father wound up being an expert tailor, but he could not knit, something the woman who ran the house they were hiding in would make the children do during the day. This came easy for Eva and Henny, but not for Joop, and when he couldn't finish his daily tasks, the woman would lock him in an attic and make him knit all alone all day. He would then drop his assignment out through a small window to Eva's waiting hands below. She would finish up the knitting for him and send it back up to him. When he presented it as his own at the end of the day, the woman would say, "See, I told you could do it if you tried." My father and his sisters were about a mile away from their home, with no idea whether the house was even still standing. They had heard their parents were betrayed, arrested, and sent away, but they were still not certain of their fates. My father's words. Soon I was separated from my two sisters also. An escort from the resistance brought me to the train station and we boarded a train together. During the course of this very long trip, I changed trains and escorts a number of times. By the time I reached the end of the line, far out into the countryside, my original escorts had no idea where I had gone or what my new name was. A farming family in the north of the country took my father in under the pretense that he was a distant relative who had been sent to be safe, get fed, and live a better life until after the war was over. The couple created a brand new identity for my father and treated him as family. They enrolled him in school, took him with the family to church, and taught him how to work the farm. His words. One day during the harvest season of 1943, I was bringing in a load of peas we had just harvested to the market. My wooden shoe caught in one of the wagon wheels and I tripped and fell, breaking my leg. I was brought to the hospital and spent the next 6 weeks in the children's ward. On the second or third day after I arrived at the hospital, the Nazis had a roundup. They marched into the village where I had been staying. For a tiny village, they were sheltering a very large number of Jews and other escapees. Every single person who was hiding, and every single person who was sheltering them, was taken to the front of the farm or house and shot on the spot. If I had not tripped and broken my leg, I would have been killed also. His leg finally healed, the resistance moved my father to Groningen and a few other places before eventually he wound up living with the family of a dairy farm director in the town of Oosterzee, where he would stay until the war was over. My dad's words. On the day the Nazis invaded Holland, my host family had gone to their dairy factory and made a special cheese that they promised not to eat until they were free once again. So on the day the war ended, my host family and I cut up the 5-year-old cheese. Old cheese tastes great. A book mentions my father as the Jewish boy hidden in the area where the factory stood during the war. He is also referenced in a 2002 newspaper article about the dairy factory buildings being torn down. The chimney from the factory remains to this day. People in the area say the chimney was saved to symbolically point up in memory of all who died during the Holocaust, and that it also remains standing to honor all that were hidden and saved in the area. Eva and Henny had very different experiences than their brother after they were separated from that initial hiding place in The Hague. I don't know the specific reasons they had for separating them, other than pure space limitations. But I do know that the resistance, or the underground as Aunt Eva calls them, was very organized, very smart, and very determined to do everything they could to save as many Jews as possible, especially the children. All three of them, my father and my two aunts, look at the resistance fighters as their heroes, the men and women who literally saved their lives again and again. And for many of them, it would cost them their lives. The two sisters were moved many times, as often as 12 times in a matter of a few months. Local residents offered to take them in and hide them, but they would quickly feel the mounting pressure and potential danger of hiding Jews. The consequences would be dire for them and their own families if they were caught. So the resistance would move them to another family, another town, always trying to stay a step ahead of the Gestapo. They were not always kept together, but they were never too far apart and would often have the chance to meet when separated. They had no direct contact with my father, but knew of his general whereabouts and well-being. At one point, my Aunt Eva wrote my father a letter around his 13th birthday, when tradition has it that Jewish boys become men by celebrating their bar mitzvah. In the letter, she praised him for the man that he'd become, and told him that she looked forward to a time when they could all see each other again. She gave the letter to the resistance fighter in hopes it would reach her brother, but even though the term bar mitzvah was not specifically used, it was determined too risky to send along. The resistance had somehow gotten both of my aunt's names off a list of people that were to be transported to Westerbork transit camp, a holding place for Jews before many of them were transported to Auschwitz and other camps, where they would ultimately be put to death. My father's parents undoubtedly went through Westerbork on their way to Auschwitz. The two girls had befriended an adult who invited them to their holding building, the Holland Schwalberg, a large theater in Amsterdam, which is now a Jewish museum. There was a surprise roll call of the people on the transport list, a list my aunts were not on. The girls were shooed into the public bathroom at the theater and told to hide out in a stall. Several Nazi soldiers searched the stalls of the bathroom and eventually came across the one with Eva and Henny. They opened the stall door and saw Eva helping Henny pull up her pants. They were pretending. These Nazis must have assumed the girls belonged and that their parents were out in the theater hall. They closed the stall door and let them be, without even bothering to check who these kids really were. Thankfully. Resistance fighters somehow got Eva and Henny out of the building before being discovered. They took them to the woods, where they ripped off the yellow stars from their clothes. The girls were back in hiding. After the war was over, there was a bitter court battle over Henny. The Christian family she was staying with when the war ended wanted to adopt her, and Henny wanted to stay with them as well. Jewish community leaders felt that they had already lost enough of their people. All parties seemed to do what they thought was best for my aunt, having her best interest in mind. Eva sided with the Jewish community, feeling that her parents would not want any of their children raised outside the Jewish religion. She testified in court and agreed to move with Henny into a Jewish orphanage in Amsterdam, where my father was already living. The girls were the first females in the orphanage and were treated wonderfully by the staff that was looking to extend the orphanage and its reputation of boys-only housing. The owner of the orphanage paired Eva up with a wealthy couple from Chicago who were in town to look at facilities they had made donations to. The couple took Eva to a fancy restaurant, and throughout the course of the evening, both quickly took a liking to the young lady. Lillian Bloomberg promised Eva that when they got back to Chicago from their European tour, she would send Eva some clothes that she didn't wear anymore, but were sure to fit her. Eva shrugged it off, having never heard from many Americans who had come through town, making promises they never kept. However, a couple of months later, she received a large package full of stylish, expensive clothes that fit her perfectly. They stayed in touch, and the Bloombergs eventually sponsored a trip for Eva to come to America. The original plan was for Eva to stay in America for a year, but she knew pretty quickly that she wanted to stay a lot longer than that. Soon she had a good job, lived in a wonderful suburban home with a loving and welcoming family. She was living a life she never dared dream of, while moving from hiding place to hiding place, always fearful of being exposed, never knowing if her parents were alive or dead. My Aunt Eva has lived in the Chicago area ever since. Meanwhile, my father was also treated very well at the orphanage. He was a member of a group of older teenagers they called the Big Guys, a harmless gang who would strut around the orphanage, bossing the younger orphans around. It was during this time that they received a letter saying that their parents had died in the concentration camp at Auschwitz. While that was enough for his sister Eva, my father was not completely convinced, and for years had hoped that they had somehow survived, and that he would see them again after such an abrupt parting. My mother related stories from early in their relationship of my father thinking he saw his parents in a crowded airport terminal or concert hall, only to have to relive his loss all over again after realizing it was, of course, not them. There was not much at all known about the fates of my grandparents, other than several recordings of their deaths at Auschwitz, 2 years apart, and their names are on a memorial in an Amsterdam park. As a young boy, not really knowing the story or circumstances, I recall having fleeting thoughts that a knock at the door or a ringing of the bell could possibly be my grandparents, who had somehow survived and made their way to us. I remember walking through the museum, relating that story to my dad one day several years ago now. He stopped in his tracks and told me that he had the same fleeting thoughts, even after he knew in his head and his heart that they were long dead. Years later, as he reflected on those times in the telling of his story to groups like you, he was still haunted by the loss of his parents and missed them dearly, even after so much time had passed. My father's words. I never got to say goodbye to my parents. Where are they? It is the last days of their lives. They are probably not together. I have no idea how much they suffer. I want to be with them one more time and to talk to them. I wish that I knew more about all they did to save our lives. I wonder why I am still living and able to tell this story and share my feelings with you. I am 12 years old and I walk out of the house with a resistance helper and I never look back. Now I wish I had turned around and waved goodbye, but maybe that would have been dangerous. I often think of my parents. I have outlived them by many years. I wonder why. Is it proper to wish my parents rest in peace? I hope so. I love them more than they ever knew. I still do. When my Aunt Eva left her native Holland for America to stay with the Bloomberg family, my dad told her that if she could find him a job, he might follow her. About a year later, he did just that. Maurice and Lillian Bloomberg sponsored his trip to America as well, getting him his job as a custom tailor for a large department store in downtown Chicago. A few years after that, he met a beautiful and delightful Chicago gal at a Jewish singles dance. The couple married and had 3 sons. I am the middle son of that family, my older brother Phil, and my younger brother Ken. Our family moved to suburban Niles when I was a young boy, and my father owned and operated several different tailor shops and dry cleaning stores. Aunt Eva was a frequent guest, especially at special occasions and on holidays, and we all loved her dearly. Yope and Aunt Eva would see Aunt Henny every couple of years when she would come here, or they would go to Holland to visit her. My brothers and I knew very little of our father's experiences during the Holocaust while we were growing up, only secondhand stories he would have told to my mother or had shared with the Bloombergs, who, by the way, we always considered our grandparents. It turns out many of the stories I'd heard or remembered were wrong or misremembered. At least some of that was by design. You see, the people who sheltered my father and helped him begin his adult life specifically told him not to tell people about what had happened. He was told the people would not believe him, and even if they did, they would not care. My father kept that hidden child within him most of his adult life as he assimilated to a new country, learned a new language, and took on the awesome responsibility of raising a family. rarely bringing up his experiences during the Holocaust. Over a decade ago, he heard a man named Sam Harris share his Holocaust survivor story at his synagogue. Excuse me. He approached Mr. Harris after his speech, introduced himself, and told him that he was one of the hidden children of Holland. Mr. Harris asked my father if he was speaking and sharing his experiences. When my father told him that he was not, Mr. Harris put his hand on his shoulder, looked him in the eye, and said, "You must. If not you, then who? And if not now, then when?" My father began speaking shortly after that, sharing his story and the lessons he learned to thousands of kids and adults in the last years of his life. And as I mentioned earlier, he was invited to share his story with the world at the General Assembly of the United Nations, but passed away exactly 1 month before. His funeral service was packed with well-wishers from all facets of his long and impactful life. And as I gazed upon the crowded funeral home hall, it occurred to me that while it took a lifetime to come to grips with what had happened during the Holocaust, to both him and his family, he was no longer hidden, physically or emotionally. That Holocaust Museum, and the people in it, and the people just like you who listened to him, brought him out of hiding and into the light to face the horrors of the Holocaust head on, and to share his story in hopes of preventing these sorts of human atrocities in the futures. No, at the time of his death, Joe Koek was not one of the hidden children. Joop was free at last. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me today. It is always a true honor for me to share my father's story and represent my family in this profound way. My father always ended his speeches with some final thoughts that I would like to share with you as I end my presentation. And I'll also copy and put it into the comments section. My father's words. What the story of the Holocaust tells us is that there are people who hate other people so much that they will kill them only because they believe different things or look different. My story tells us that there are also people who will do anything to save others, including risking their own lives. My wish is that you will grow up and belong to the second group. Thank you very much. Oh, let me copy and paste this on there. Well, thank you, Courtney, and thank you all for stopping by and listening. A special thanks to Amanda Friedemann, who has now trained 2 generations of Koeks to be a part of the Speakers Bureau at the Holocaust Museum, at the Illinois Holocaust Museum, and Sierra Wolf in the Communications Department for setting this up for me, this great opportunity to share my father's story with all of you. So join us here next Wednesday at 10 a.m. to hear a real Holocaust survivor, first-generation Holocaust survivor, Marguerite Mishkin, share her story. Please keep an eye on the Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook and other social media accounts, where we will post a stream of content throughout the weeks ahead. Remember, folks, this is only temporary. The museum at some point will be reopened, and when you do return, check out the audio tour app, where both my father and aunt's story are featured. Thank you for your support during these extraordinary times.